Hi, everyone. Welcome to Red May 6, 2022. Days like this. I'm Sean Landis, filling in for Philip Wolstetter on the MC today. If you're not familiar, Red May is a month-long series of communist and socialist events celebrating red theory, red art, red histories, and politics. Today's event is the Afterlives of Global Slavery. It's a conversation between Yogita Goyal and Paul Nadal. But before I pass the mic off to Paul, let me tell you about some events we have coming up this week. I'm hearing myself. So tomorrow, on Sunday, May 15th at 11 a.m., we have Walter Benjamin's Message in a Bottle with Johanna Goss, Esther Leslie, Daniel Morenza, and forgive me, Meek Schmidt Gleam. And on Wednesday, May 18th at 11 a.m., we have Confronting the Obstacles to Climate Security with David Schwartzman, Kay Aronoff, Matthias Schmelzer, and Sue Hildreth. If you are in Seattle with us, come on Tuesday to the Beacon Cinema. That's May 17th at 7:30 p.m. as we continue our film series with around Milos Janskos films. We'll be watching the brutal 1969 Winter Wind. Usually, we have a good time, have conversations afterwards, eat some popcorn, have some wine, enjoy one another. And then also, if you're with us this week on May 20th at Third Place Books, Andy Getlitz of Antifada fame is doing a book tour around the U.S. on I Want to Believe. I believe that was a 2020 release. And that's again at Third Place Books, I think at 7 o'clock. So I'm going to pass the mic over to Paul Nadal, who is an assistant professor of English and American Studies at Princeton University, where he teaches courses in Asian American literature and Marxist aesthetic theory. He's completing a book about Philippine literature in relation to the political economy of labor export and migrant remittances. A chapter from that book recently appeared in American Quarterly and won last year's Best Essay Prize from the American Literature Society. And he is in conversation with Yogita, who is a professor of African American Studies and English at UCLA. She specializes in modern and contemporary literature and the study of race and post-colonialism, with a particular emphasis on African diaspora literature from the 19th century to the present. She's the author of Romance, Diaspora, and Black Atlantic Literature, Runaway Genres, The Global Afterlives of Slavery, and editor of the Cambridge Companion to Transnational American Literature. Most of her work foregrounds the articulation of literary form with social and political change, with a view to rethinking questions of social justice and ethics in historical and continuing forms of inequality. You are watching the Global Afterlives of Slavery. This is Red May. Take it away, Paul.
Great. Thanks so much, Sean. First, I want to express my gratitude to Philip, who isn't here today, for the invitation, and to you, Sean, for substituting. It's my first Red May, and I'm super excited to do this event with Yogita and to use this forum to discuss her really amazing, brilliant book, Runaway Genres. I'm a big fan of the work, and which I think really works through some long-standing questions within Marxist critical theory about the place of literature and culture in Marxist historical materialism, as well as the question of race, indeed the history and legacies of slavery in our existing historical accounts of the development of capitalism. A question that has enjoyed a kind of resurgence given the proliferation of the concept of racial capitalism in much of the theorizing that is being done today. And so I thought I'd say a few words first about what I took to be some of Yogita's main points in Runaway Genres to get us started. And then I'll ask a question to Yogita, and then she'll take it from there. And so When I was thinking about how to paraphrase this book, it was very challenging. I mean, it's no small feat to summarize a book like Runaway Genres. It defies easy paraphrase because in Yogita's approach to 20th and 21st century Neoslave narratives, the book generates broader investigations into labor migrations, refugee crises, the limits of human rights discourse, and humanitarian sentimentalism. It's also a book about the power of literary satire and Gothic narratives, the routes of Black mobility, and the global circulation of slavery as either subject matter or historical framework in literary fiction today. The book is even a sustained meditation on the logical category we call analogy. It's a reflection on that category in order to develop what she calls a new comparative literacy. As Yogita notes in this book, we find everywhere today frequent analogies to slavery in making sense of modern forms of labor exploitation and human immiseration. In this context, she calls for critical uses of analogy. She writes that to make analogy work, we need both correspondence and difference, and to see historical slavery's meanings as still unsettled. Present-day arguments based on analogy work if and only if it is coupled with critical consciousness of history as well as a more thorough knowledge of the present. Analogy becomes critical when it proceeds to examine, and here I'm quoting Yogita, what might be, so analogy works if it proceeds to examine what might be new about forms of power today and whether the architecture of contemporary state terror, including police killings and drones and repression at the border, is best apprehended and resisted by referring to the past of slavery and abolition, or whether it entails newer configurations. So I'm really interested in this question of how to think about the past and the present and the kind of work that needs to be done in order to do this kind of temporal translation or kind of critical comparativism that this figure of the analogy performs for you. Here I found your set of questions in the introduction especially poignant. You ask, is slavery an anachronism, a sign of the past in the present, a symbol of unresolved inequities, a wound that is still unfolding? These questions bear in them broader questions about how to understand historical change and the persistence of social forms of power and survival. So, as you can tell from this very short précis, the scope of the subject matter is broad. The depth and range of the literary archives is very deep, and the arguments are very timely, and so it's no surprise to me that the book has garnered so many awards, and deservedly so. In Runaway Genres, literary exegesis develops into political reflection. So, for example, the question of how a literary form travels from one location to another, say, the question of what it means to write an African experience in an American genre, like the immigrant novel, becomes also a question about the translatability or comparability of experience, and whether the proper response to systemic violence, exploitation, is empathy, anger, intervention, or something else. As a study of Black diasporic writing, Runaway Genres is rigorously historicist and formalist. So these are the two words that appear in the introduction of the book, and I was very excited to see them expressed as such. By historicist and formalist, I took Yogita to mean that she's really interested in how the literary example is not merely an object to be contextualized and filled in, but as itself productive of historical knowledge and sociological insight. Form in this book proceeds according to the Lukácsian conviction that form is where the social content of literature resides. The readings that she develops over the course of the chapters also remind me of what the great Brazilian literary critic Roberto Schwartz once said of the concept of form, which is that form, he writes, indexes the profound synthesis of the movement of history. But it's interesting that the operative word in Runaway Genres is not so much form, but the related concept of genre. And I hope we can spend some time unpacking what the concept of genre enables you to do in your work and in your thinking. So I was struck that the book is recent. It was published in 2018, and it was interesting to me to notice that around that year there was actually a lot of criticism published that focused on the question of genre. So I'm thinking here of Jed Essie's book on the Bildungsroman, Jeremy Rosen's on minor characters, Lee Claire LeBurge on finance fiction, Ted Martin on contemporary, Beth Bloom on self-help literature, and Mark Jang's book on popular genre fiction, which you actually cite and engage in order to elaborate what I think distinguishes your book in this cohort, namely your sustained investigation into the dialectic of race and genre, right? So how to read one through the other, and how to grasp race and genre not only as modes of aesthetic representation, but as a kind of technology of differentiation and even transmission. And so when I was thinking about, okay, great, this is, we need more work like this. It really takes seriously the dialectic of race and genre. And on one side of the equation, the genre side, a lot of people have been really empowered by and have taken a cue from Frederick Jameson's The Political Unconscious, right? Which I can't believe was published 40 years ago. Now, I think the MLA just celebrated its 40th anniversary. And as folks in this room will know, in that book, Jameson singled out genre criticism for its privileged relationship with historical materialism, right? In that book, Jameson defined the strategic value of genre for Marxist cultural critique by suggesting that genre, and here I'm quoting Jameson, genre allows a coordination of imminent formal analysis of the individual text with a twin diachronic perspective of the history of forms and the evolution of social life, right? So it's a kind of double movement. It's a double movement of going into the form of the work in order to look outward, right, into history, into the social evolution of aesthetic forms. And it's a double movement that I think that your book enacts quite elegantly. And so from Jameson, we learned that genre historicizes, and so of course a position that you've developed already and demonstrated in your first book, Romance, Diaspora, and Black Atlantic Literature. In that book, for those who haven't read it, it was published in 2010. It's equally amazing. You showed how what you call Black Atlantic texts are kind of they form an eclectic genre where, and this I'm quoting you, the realist narrative of the nation is interrupted by the romance of the diaspora, right? So there's an alignment of genre and kind of geopolitics there. And in that prior book, as in this one, Runaway Genres, to study genre is to study politics and aesthetics at once. And so if genre has a material shaping force, I think one of the lessons of this book is that so does race, right? That genre and race, they have this kind of really interesting kind of dialectic. I'm thinking here also of, outside of literary studies, how genre appears in, say, the theoretical work around Afro-pessimism, or even Sylvia Wynter's extremely suggestive phrase, genres of being human, right? That there's something there that there's something about thinking about race, about Black subjectivity that opens and invites questions and thinking about genre. So my last point, just as a way of opening up the conversation. So race, genre. I'm also interested in speaking with you about racial capitalism. So if there's a recent turn to genre studies, I think there's also, a recent turn to really think about the agency of race in capitalist accumulation processes, right? Recent work that circulates around the sign of racial capitalism have shown how capitalism developed by reworking rather than negating or superseding prior racist institutions and modes of racial violence. Here, Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, as you know, has become a key text. There, his thesis is that American slavery ought to be understood as a subsystem of world capitalism. And that thesis has really inspired new research into the co-evilness of race and capital. And so it's interesting to me that these investigations into the co-evilness of the histories of racism and capitalism takes on a kind of global perspective. And your book about the afterlives of slavery also takes on a kind of global framework, right? And so I thought that part of what we can do today is to thread those connections, make those connections a little bit more. And so I guess the first question I want to ask is, for those who are not familiar with the book, for you to have the opportunity to give your own account of its motivations, its arguments, and maybe how you thought about organizing and choosing the literary texts that you write about and that you feature in Runaway Genres.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Paul. Let me also thank Philip and Sean and all the organizers of Red May. It's also my first Red May, and I'm really excited to be here. Paul, it's always a treat to talk to you, and I'm so excited that we'll get to go over some of these incredibly generative questions that you've brought up. And so I have a sort of a brief prepared statement that basically stages some of the questions that I was looking at in the book. And so let me sort of try and get through those, and then we'll back to the questions that you've posed for us. So let me begin with a moment from Octavia Butler's prophetic 1993 novel, Parable of the Sower, which 2 years ago in 2020 finally became a bestseller, as the author had hoped, right? So Butler writes, "Something new is beginning, or perhaps something old and nasty is reviving." The novel imagines a dystopian future in California where ecological and economic crises combine to produce fiercely guarded, gated communities with security forces armed with whips and pistols. Butler represents a post-apocalyptic landscape where gated colonies are under constant threat from the street poor, while pyromania, vaguely linked to a hatred of the rich, sweeps the nation. As she explains in an interview, the novel is a cautionary tale about growing inequality, environmental catastrophe, increasing exploitation of labor by corporations, unregulated drugs, and the failure of governments to build social institutions like schools or libraries and focus on prisons instead. Or, as Butler puts it, quote, "I imagine the United States becoming slowly a third world country." As the young girl at the center of the novel loses her home and family, setting out into the landscape of survival of the fittest, the novel meditates on how this imagined future connects to or revives the old and nasty past. Lauren Olamina dreams of going north, maybe as far as Canada, echoing the flight of the fugitive slave to freedom and gathering, quote, "the crew of a modern underground railroad." Butler piercingly probes the question of whether the diverse forms of power and surveillance in this near future world, including forced labor, debt bondage by corporations, polygamy, prostitution, domestic servitude, and an eerily prophetic president who wants to make America great again, involve a repetition of the logic that undergirded the control and exploitation of Black people under slavery. The novel gestures to many different forms of slavery: domestic servitude, debt slavery, forced prostitution, sale as a wife, without establishing one as the template for the other. Olamina is beset by a biological conscience, afflicted with hyperempathy syndrome, which forces her to feel the pain of others. Confronted with unspeakable challenges, she wonders if her malady could also be a cure. And this is from the novel. If hyperempathy syndrome were a more common complaint, people couldn't do such things. If everyone could feel everyone else's pain, who would torture? Who would cause anyone unnecessary pain? So these three concerns of the novel also encompass the project of Runaway Genres. Connection between the historical past of slavery in the United States and contemporary conditions of abuse, exploitation, and displacement forms the center of my concerns. What is the relation between a failing United States and the Third World? How might recalling Atlantic slavery help us not just exhume the past, but salvage the future by understanding contemporary forms of slavery, forced migration, and indentured labor? And might empathy extend a means to join the United States to the globe, a reader to an author, the connective tissue for a new kind of community? Finally, what is the role of reading and writing in all of this? In Butler's sequel, Parable of the Talents from 2000, we have a horrific return to slavery for Olamina's group. Undergoing conditions of extreme brutality, she again turns to writing as a way of making sure that she can still imagine a future. Directly echoing the slave narrator's path to freedom, she insists, "My writing is a way for me to remind myself that I am human." So that slavery offers these immense aesthetic and political resources to contemporary African American writers is, of course, not surprising. We can easily trace current forms of inequality and race-based discrimination to slavery, both as institutional and psychic afterlives, as structures and as structures of feeling. And I think Paul touched on some of this in his remarks just now, but philosophies of history derived from slavery, inquiries into practices of archival recovery, studies of racial capitalism, and debates about ethics and affect have assumed center stage in current scholarship. In recent years, extensive activism around prison abolition, debates about reparations, Confederate statues, antebellum nostalgia, calls for accounting for the university's connection to slavery, and renewed attention to ideologies of white supremacy and anti-Blackness have all helped shape the volatile afterlife of slavery in the political sphere. In literature especially, the dominance of the Neoslave narrative over the last 4 decades is now axiomatic. It's in fact difficult to think of a major African American writer who has not returned to the scene of slavery. So we can see the works of such writers as Dion Brand, Charles Johnson, Edward Jones, Toni Morrison, Shirley Ann Williams, and Colson Whitehead, not just as attempts to memorialize slavery and its constitutive role in any conception of the nation's past, present, and future, but also to repair the omissions of the slave narrative, especially those moments, and here I'm quoting Toni Morrison, over and over, the writers pull the narrative up short with a phrase such as, "But let us drop a veil over these proceedings too terrible to relate." This is why Morrison seeks to, as she says, rip that veil and to fill in the blank slave narratives left. In contrast to such efforts by African American writers to distance themselves from the compromised conditions of production of the slave narrative, these conditions surprisingly return in a literal manner as the Atlantic frame goes global. In the 21st century, slavery has emerged as the defining template through which current forms of human rights abuses are understood, demanding new ways of understanding racial formation across past and present landscapes and in relation to new geographies of terror and containment. Neo-abolitionist movements to end child labor, human rights campaigns against human trafficking and the rights of refugees and asylum seekers, feminist efforts to end the exploitation of sex workers, populist advocacy for animal rights, anti-abortion efforts, discrimination based on caste, activism against incarceration, and the abuse of migrant labor all make rampant use of slavery to elicit support for their cause. And to do so, they rely on the same power of narrative that abolitionists once did. As one Boston editor put it in 1840, argument provokes argument, reason is met by sophistry, but narratives of slaves go right to the hearts of men. Continuing this appeal to the hearts of men, writers across the globe, from India to Ireland, Nigeria to Uganda, Haiti to South Africa, Sri Lanka to Sierra Leone, are reviving the slave narrative, a clearly bounded historical genre created for the single purpose of arguing for the abolition of slavery. So my book takes up these questions of what does it mean to view the life of a Sudanese refugee or a lost boy through the black-white binary of Atlantic slavery, or to narrate the experience of a child soldier in Liberia as the afterlife of slavery. Why does Frederick Douglass's 1845 narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave written by himself, make an appearance not only in African-American fiction by Charles Johnson, Alice Randall, and James McBride, but also in Colum McCann's Transatlantic, in Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's novel about Nigeria's civil war, Half of a Yellow Sun, and in Helen Oyeyemi's uncanny Boy Snow Bird. To answer these questions, I locate the global proliferation of the slave narrative at the confluence of three forces: increasing large-scale migration, the ongoing appeal of sentimentalism to narrate trauma, and a historical tendency to see current events as repetitions of the past. The slave narrative, a story of escape from bondage, presented as a sentimental appeal to the reader's empathy, often vouched for by a sympathetic white editor, uncannily matches contemporary accounts of refugees, asylum seekers, survivors of trafficking and conscription and war. In an age when feeling, affect, and empathy appear as substitutes for social change, the sentimental idiom favored by abolitionists comes in handy to narrate stories of oppression from the global South. Returning to the past by replaying tropes of the slave narrative, including accounts of exile and natal alienation, the concept of social death, the quest for literacy, the journey north to freedom, and dreams of the Jubilee, contemporary literature chronicles the history of violence in a world that has not yet figured out a politics of reconciliation or reckoning. To understand this proliferation, we not only need to return to the question of what slavery itself means, but also account for how and when the slave narrative became malleable as a global form, available for adaptation across time and space. Enshrining the language of sentimentalism as the most effective weapon in the human rights arsenal, the discourse of modern slavery defines a global relation between us and them solely.
Oh no, it looks like we might have lost Yogita. Sean, are you there? Okay, there you are.
I'm back.
Hi.
I don't know why I got kicked out suddenly, but let me resume. So I'm talking about the use of the language of sentimentalism in a number of human rights, in a lot of human rights discourse today, specifically the discourse of modern slavery, which defines a global relation between us and them solely as a matter of sentiment. To do so, bestseller memoirs, activist campaigns, and media spectacles converge to propose that the history of US slavery must be seen as the present and future of the rest of the world. Such a claim, I suggest, not only simplifies our understanding of the unresolved legacy of slavery in the United States, but also disorders our comprehension of the nature of exploitation and abuse in the present across the globe. Making slavery mobile like this, not just as metaphor, but as the exemplary frame for thinking about oppression today, requires reckoning with what it might mean to insist on slavery as exception instead. It also requires a deeper consideration of the shift in geographic scale from Atlantic to global. Consider, for instance, Mohamedou Ould Slahi's memoir, Guantanamo Diary from 2015, outlining his 14-year-long unlawful detention and torture in Guantanamo Bay, which explicitly likens his rendition from Mauritania to Atlantic slavery. For Slahi, strategies of offshore detention, black sites, waterboarding, enhanced interrogation, kill lists, and extraordinary rendition that characterized the war on terror since 9/11 might be connected to the scenes of subjection that birthed the nation, as well as the engineering of social death. And I'm, of course, referring to the titles of very foundational books on slavery by Saidiya Hartman and Orlando Patterson. Enclosed by the sympathetic editor's preface, marketed as an international human rights event by the publisher, and censored and reshaped by the CIA and the US government, Guantanamo Diary chillingly repeats what John Sikora termed the black message in a white envelope of the slave narrative. In such genres as the African child soldier novel, similar efforts to transform a state of forced abjection into humanist triumph, precisely through the power of narrative, promotes feeling over reason, the moral education of the Western reader over the political agency of the victim. In these works, America's past becomes Africa's present, and rather than the hell on earth of antebellum slave narratives, the US appears as the savior for fugitive slaves as asylum seekers. An example of a nation that has transcended its own horrific past, while nations like Sudan or Uganda or Liberia or Sierra Leone are narrated as a site of no political possibility or agency, with little effort to provide historical context or specificity for the conflicts described. In response, and rejecting such sentimental substitutions, the white reader for the traumatized slave, immigrant life in the US as redemption for the slave past, writers across the African diaspora create new genres that model different forms of relation across space and time. So in my book, I explore the uses of the Gothic for writers like Chris Abani, Amadou Kuruma, and Ken Saro-Wiwa, satire for Paul Beatty, Matt Johnson, and Colson Whitehead, the reinvention of the talking book of the slave narrative by Morrison, Carol Phillips, and Robin Costa Lewis, and finally, the new genres insisted on by the new African diaspora in the works of Teju Cole, Chimamanda Adichie, Dinah Mengistu, and Noviolet Bulawayo. As we move away from empathy as the primary affective response demanded from the reader, the writers of these runaway genres evoke outrage, horror, humor, revulsion, and rumination, favoring aesthetic complication and historical entanglement over identification. My hope is that as we try and conceive of racial formations in the 21st century in global contexts, tracing the circulation of a quintessential American genre, the slave narrative, may help generate new insights about how forms code social relationships and networks of power. If Todorov is right in noting that a new genre is always the transformation of one or several old genres, by inversion, by displacement, by combination, then my analysis of the circulation of the slave narrative in contemporary culture should tell us something about how and why history repeats itself as form. Extending Todorov's maxim about the origin of genres, from where do genres come from, he asks, why quite simply from other genres, we may say that contemporary racial formations also come from pre-existing alignments and configurations from other times and places. And so let me stop there. And Paul, I think that the place I ended at sort of leads us nicely into the questions that you had brought up. So let me turn it over to you to see if there's a particular place that you'd like us to get going on.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really helpful. I was really curious about how the figure of repetition appears in your work. You just said that part of what the book is thinking about is why history repeats itself as a form, and that there's something about the literal return to slave narratives that is not only a kind of time travel back to the past, but is also a way of comprehending the uncanniness of the present and also the persistence of these forms of domination and power. And so with repetition, I want to invite you to say a few words about this idea of afterlife, the afterlives of slavery, specifically the kind of temporality that you see that notion of the afterlife doing. I asked this question because I was really struck that you began with Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, and then there too there's a kind of proleptic kind of relation to the near future, but one that is also tearing with kind of the legacies of the past, right? So clearly it's not a kind of linear teleological historicism that we have here regarding the afterlives of slavery, but something else. It's a kind of coevalness or kind of simultaneous non-simultaneity, something like that, right? So I wonder if you could just say a few words about how you're thinking about the this idea the afterlives of slavery.
Mhm. Absolutely. I mean, I think, of course, many of us would attribute sort of the circulation of the phrase afterlife of slavery to Saidiya Hartman's very influential work. And I actually think for me, there's an essay that she wrote quite a while ago called The Time of Slavery. And, some of the ideas there, I think, were reshaped and sort of thought through in a different way in Lose Your Mother, which came several years later. So I think that's sort of obviously the direct point of reference. But I think that even if we look at even if we look at the historical accounts of slavery that we have, right, that have come into the present, for us to be able to work with, and certainly if we look at more recent returns to the subject, one of the very straightforward assertions there is that you simply cannot think of history, and this is something you already said, Paul, either in a linear developmental way, right, with just this kind of that we are, the liberal notion that we are, and I'll just use the phrase that President Obama used to use all the time, that we are progressing toward a more perfect union, right? Like that kind of. So we really don't find that in the literature of slavery at all, at any point, I think. And there's also a great deal of resistance to the notion that there are significant ruptures, right? So that the moment of emancipation, right, the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, the end of the Civil War, we could go to any number of moments, right, that they are somehow going to be these defining moments that will change people's sense of who they are and what they can do. And these legal shifts, long awaited, important in a lot of ways, but inadequate in a lot of ways as well, right? So there's been sort of a long sense, I think, in the field of studies of abolition and slavery, a sense of the unfinishedness of the project itself, right? The incomplete achievement of freedom, the incompleteness of the project itself. So I think that's kind of the basic, I think that's what's behind the idea, obviously, of afterlife in the field. I think there's a couple of other things that are definitely on my mind in this book, and I think more broadly speaking too. And again, the way you phrased the question already sort of stages those for us. So, we all, I think, are familiar with Time and the Other, right? The Fabian. And so for me, it's always been really interesting to think about sort of when we go back in time, or we go across in space, right? So what happens to time and space when we are doing these kinds of things? This is why I think analogy is such an important part of this book for me, and questions of comparison, because of course, as you know, most often what happens when we go across in space is that we also go back in time. And in fairly simplistic kind of ways of assuming that the world is somehow behind and trying to catch up to some developmental stage that those of us who live in the first world have already achieved. So I think some of those questions about how do we think as scholars, as literary scholars, as scholars of cultural studies, how do we think about what has happened to race and racial formation in the 21st century in particular? And really, I say 21st century, but really talking about roughly from late 70s to the present, right? That's the body of work that I'm looking at, sort of these 4 or 5 decades that we have. What's happening in this time to race and racial formation? How do we understand it? Do we create genealogies, in terms of literature, but more broadly as well, through looking at immediately what came before, which in the US context obviously would be the Black Arts Movement, where there's a very different understanding of slavery, right? Like there's a very different relationship to it, and there's a lot of disavowal. There's a lot of anxiety that slavery represents the site of Black victimhood, and so the goal is to kind of get away from it. And so, really trying to think about how and when we've returned to these questions, and how they've allowed us to maybe think of a different kind of moment of dialogue across the African diaspora. So the most familiar moment, I think, for many of us is, again, the 60s, right? So we were very familiar with those stories of decolonization, civil rights movement, connecting. And again, very important stories from Bandung on, right? Martin Luther King, Gandhi, all of the stuff that's happening at that time. But I've always been sort of interested in thinking about what other moments can we look at that create that sense of relation. And so in this book, I obviously turn to the contemporary moment and look at how the analytic of slavery can become the anchor for this really fascinating discussion across Black diaspora writers, right, and others as well, about questions of origin, questions of, how do we relate to our various national sites? How do we think about our identity? How do books circulate? How do ideas circulate? How do we create notions of, our own kind of personal and collective notions of beginnings and endings? And then in my first book, I had started the book with thinking about, another kind of very fraught moment, which at the time, it seemed to me we didn't quite have the conceptual vocabulary to know what to do with it, which is the Back to Africa movement from the mid to late 19th century, which led to the founding of Liberia. And so really thinking about how do we make sense of something that you can clearly see as a white nationalist project of expulsion, right? But couched in the language, and sometimes owned as such, of Black self-determination, nationalist reclamation. So it just seemed like a really kind of difficult moment for us to be able to understand what's happening to concepts of race and nation and belonging, right? Belonging to a place, going back to that place, what kinds of questions emerge and what kinds of questions are obscured by these kinds of movements across time and space.
No, that's really great. And I'm going to follow up at, just want to, Yogita and I can't see who's in the room, but I want to encourage everyone to post their questions on the chat. I'm not sure exactly how you do that, but I think there is a button that you press. And so please feel free to send your questions in, and I'll make sure to incorporate them into the discussion. So the question of the afterlife, I think that's right. It's clearly, from Hartman, we're thinking here not in chronological terms, right? Like that slavery was past and etc. But really thinking about its persistence, its repetition, but its repetition with a difference. But the other side of that is this critique that you have about this facile kind of citation of slavery to talk about labor exploitation, to talk about human trafficking, to talk about forms of physical kind of abuse and dehumanizing practices, right? That there's something inaccurate, politically enfeebling about citing these contemporary instances as slavery. So that's interesting because it seems to be, right, like what keeps those references, those analogies to slavery, what falls short in that kind of speech act, right? Because those maybe who are not familiar with the argument might see like, well, aren't they in fact arguing for the kind of continuance of slavery by positing this analogy?
Yeah, that's a really important distinction. I'm glad you brought that up. So I would say that when I talk about the writers that create these productive openings for thinking about the project of abolition is unfinished, or so I'm really thinking about the writers that I look at in the kind of later part of the book, right? But the part of the issue, and I'm very critical of it, is that what we've seen happening in the 21st century is the rise of the modern slavery movement, right? This whole idea that exactly as you said, Paul, that we can understand things like human trafficking or conscription in war as literal instances of slavery. And so, in fact, what I was surprised by when I looked at the work of some of these neo-abolitionist organizations, like Free the Slaves, Walk Free Foundation, Christian Solidarity International, I was actually really surprised by the fact, but I was surprised to see how different their language and their understanding of Atlantic slavery is from what we find as scholarly field, right? So in fact, they do assume a kind of closure the question of slavery in the US context. And so then they present the abolitionist movement as one of the greatest international human rights movement. They present it as an unqualified success. And the idea is that, so we did this once in the 19th century, let's do it again. Let's revive exactly those same strategies and those techniques precisely because they were so successful for the 21st century. And as I'm sure you can already hear, that to me is a deeply problematic move, not only because it denies, the specificity of the situation that we're facing right now, but it also, it's problematic on both ends, because then it suggests that there's a kind of triumphalism at work, in other words. In the domestic context, the idea is that the problems here have been resolved. And so now we're going to take everything that was shaped here over to the third world, very much sort of with this idea of, what's obsolescent here, what's obsolete here is still new and fresh over there. And a lot of the actual work that these organizations do has come under sort of a great deal of scrutiny and criticism, rightly so, because they don't always engage with the work that's being done on the ground. And they have, they have fairly circumscribed ideas about, precisely the kinds of concepts that scholarship on slavery has opened up, right? So ideas of agency, ideas of, again, there's a lot of work in feminist studies about how do we think about, prostitution, how do we think about forced marriage, and so on. But there's certainly a branch of the neo-abolitionist discourse that's quite carceral in its approach, right? So those are the kinds of things that I'm sort of very, very critical of. And it's quite remarkable how there is a refusal to engage the geopolitics of both here and there, right? So in the US context, it seems very, again, when I started reading this work sort of several years ago, I assumed that there would be an engagement with, the politics of mass incarceration or the exploitation of labor or, questions around migration. And I was really surprised to see that none of that is there. And in fact, what we have is a very simplistic kind of tableau of, it's very individualized. So it's really not systemic at any level. It's not about structure or institutions. It's very much about, evoking a very strong feeling based on a first-person narrative from somebody who has been, hyper exploited in some way. And then, so this kind of triangle that's created of this innocent victim, often a child, who's been abused. There's a humanitarian savior, usually white, not always, but always Western, and then the kind of evil adult in this third world country who has failed, who has either failed or harmed this child. And that's the level at which we're working. So it was really weird that to describe something like that, why do you need to rewrite Frederick Douglass, right? Why do you rewrite Harriet Jacobs? And these, again, I don't want to suggest that I'm indulging in some kind of wonderful act of close reading here, because it is explicit. So they'll say in their preface or their title, this is modeled on Frederick Douglass, this is modeled on Harriet Jacobs. They'll use some of the same language, some of the same structure. So there again, to go back to your first question about repetition, it's an exact repetition. It's very much to say, this happened before, this is happening again. And the goal is to, again, very similar to what we saw in the 19th century and kind of the more mainstream versions of abolitionist movements, the goal is the moral education of the reader. The goal is that, by showing you the humanity of this figure, the suffering humanity, how they're being violated by violence. You're going to be moved to tears, and then you're going to be moved to action. And so several of these books, again, these are human rights bestsellers. That you see them in airports, you see them, they're very sensationalized. These are not usually the kinds of books we teach in our classes for good reasons. There's often some kind of sort of paraliterary or kind of like there might be a website that they direct you to where you can make a donation or learn more or sign up for some kind of campaign, right? So there's this kind of direct action suggested. Now, again, as we know, part of what Hartman and a host of other scholars of slavery, like they are not suggesting any kind of simple reckoning. Like, to insist on the afterlife of slavery is neither to say that anything has been settled, nor to suggest that there's a simple solution. But to explore precisely those impossibilities and incommensurabilities that are raised by these hauntings across past and present. So it's a very different project from the modern slavery project.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really clarifying the way you're describing your critique in the book of neo-abolitionist discourse. And is particularly struck by what you said earlier, that part of what's problematic about this kind of uncritical use of analogies to slavery is that it betrays a refusal of what you just said is the geopolitics of here and there, right? Which is a mode of thinking that is systemic, that is structural, that is global, or to put in Marxist terms, that thinks about social life in its totality, right? And with this question of totality, I guess one of the things that I wanted to discuss during our time here, this goes back to my prior remarks about why genre, is the way Runaway Genres, it does give a view into this social totality insofar as you're tracing, right, the circulation of this global form that is a slave narrative in the late 20th century. And part of the one way that your book reconstructs this, it's not a word that you use, but this kind of view of social totality is by moving across different scales of analysis, right? And so the challenge of writing about genre is that you're required to think about a large set of texts, right? Which at the level of the sentence means you can't but just kind of work at the level of the summary. At the same time, genre criticism in its historical materialist vein, right, asks a kind of more inward kind of movement, right? That double movement of like looking inside into the form in order to evaluate and think about kind of the social outside. And so for those who are interested in writing this kind of criticism in the audience, could you say a little bit about how you managed that kind of challenge, if you in fact confronted it, right? Of how to talk about, these instances of these generic kind of conventions, but then also balancing that with actual close reading, and then bringing in the other genres of knowledge production, say anti-abolitionist discourse, or what critics say about someone like Paul Beatty or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, that was absolutely a challenge that I struggled with for a long time. And for me, and again, Paul, you brought this up in your opening remarks, which I found sort of really helpful. Jameson's political unconscious has obviously been really formative for how I think about genre sort of throughout my work. And when I first started writing this book, there was so much material, and I didn't know there would be, right? So I sort of started out by I obviously knew the kind of African American neo-slave narrative. I'd been teaching it, and it's very visible, obviously. And then when I discovered that there were all these kinds of bestseller
Mm.
neo-slave narratives being written, and they were being written from places like Sudan and Liberia and so on, it was really sort of eye-opening. And so I started searching for those, and it was completely overwhelming how many there are. And
Mhm.
when I sort of started presenting on this work at conferences and so on, one of the suggestions I got from audiences is that, what, maybe you really can't talk about a single text, but you really
Mm.
think about them as a composite, right?
Mm.
That sort of addresses the question that you had raised. And for me, I resisted that, because for me, the kind of getting into the kind of granularity of particular texts
Mhm.
is really important. And so even there are many books that I really like that do the kind of overview, right? Especially in, again, you named some of these already, and there's others that we could think of. A lot of people are doing sort of really interesting work to try and fathom what's happening to contemporary literature, right? Kind of take broad,
Mhm.
like a broad, overview kind of look. And I like reading that stuff, but then I also want the granular, right? Like, I also want something that I can hold on to. And so I ended up, again, initially, the whole book could have been about modern slavery. So I was thinking about, it could have been about, so I could have pursued these kinds of analogies that we've talked about, right? Like, we've talked about things like, uh, things like, uh, incarceration literature, literature of confinement, as Tara Green calls it. We could look at migrant labor. And so there was a point at which I thought the whole book could be about that. And that's when I got worried that, it would be incredibly repetitive on my part,
Mm.
right? So
Mhm.
I decided that I would kind of finish off the argument I wanted to make about this kind of human rights bestseller moment as efficiently as I could in the first chapter. And then it was really important for me to move on to what I saw as much more sophisticated conversations, right? Whether they're happening in the Nigerian novel, whether they're happening in the
Mm.
US novel. And I'm really happy that I did that, so that we could, um, I mean, like, I suppose that book could be written, but, I don't know that anyone needs to read that, 5 chapters over 5 chapters and so on. So that's sort of how I dealt with that, sort of very, it's a good question, because there's, the more you read, the more you find the same formula, right? And that
Right. Mhm.
formulaic quality of these texts is absolutely what I'm tracking as well. But it's a trickier thing to learn how to figure out how to manage this in your own writing.
Yeah, yeah, and I just really appreciate that the book for the way it models how to do that kind of multi-scalar genre criticism. And so I just noticed that before I pose that question about genre and scale, that someone in the audience had asked a related question, and I'll just go ahead and read the question here. And this is, I don't have the name, but from what but I'll just read the question. So an audience member asked, what are the challenges of practicing genre criticism when dealing with contemporary literature, when genre seems somewhat to have been subsumed under, inter alia, categories on Amazon?
Yeah, that's a great question. Uh, Amazon, one example, and this is a novel I ended up not writing about,
Mm.
although it's certainly relevant. So one example of the kinds of things the person in the audience is bringing up would be Ya Jassi's Homegoing.
Mm. Mhm.
So that's a novel that was sort of very heavily marketed by I believe it's called the Vine program on Amazon. And actually, Paul, your colleague, Kinohi Nishikawa, has written about
Mm.
this, right? So in some ways, that novel, even before it was published, uh,
Mhm.
had kind of become uh, uh, had been accorded a particular kind of status, right?
Mm.
Through the
Mm.
fine reviews that Amazon had solicited, because they sort of predicted that this would happen, right? So that's an example of kind of the corporate control of the
Yeah.
things that were, so even, and I think Yajasi is incredibly talented, right? So this is not a knock on her, on her work in any way, but it shows you that, we, like, exactly as the person in the audience is bringing up, we can't assume that these writers are, operating obviously outside of market forces. I do worry sometimes, and this is, there's been a welcome shift in the field, to acknowledge these market forces, to do kind of, sociology of the book, like literary sociologies of things that are happening. I do wonder, though, sometimes, and I'm thinking specifically about, literature that's marketed as anti-racist literature or post-colonial literature. And sometimes I think that we tend to assume maybe too much that that the corporations have fully hijacked the possibilities that exist in in these bodies of work, right? So I think that, I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm reaching towards something like relative autonomy, as a as a place to land at. So I think that like, it's absolutely, especially the fact that so many of the writers I look at, and these are not the kind of bestseller ones, but the literary fiction that I look at, won major awards. They circulate as very visible, international literary celebrities, and so on. And so one of the other sort of responses I often get from readers, or maybe not readers, but people who haven't maybe read the book, but they've seen it talked about, is a kind of suspicion that because it's making all this noise, right? Like, I don't know, like Adichie's Americana, or Taking Cold Open City, or something, or No Violet Bulawayo's We Need New Names, that maybe that makes it less valuable for analysis than something that is circulating in more local circles, right? Like, to, as scholars who are based in the United States, we don't want to keep on reinscribing that hegemony of which texts circulate in the metropole versus in the post-colony. And I think that's a really legitimate question. But sometimes I think that, we also have to be careful not to fetishize, this notion that there is some kind of authentic voice that has not been captured by the market. And if we could only learn that as critics, we would learn something, right? So I think that the writers I'm reading are perfectly aware of these forces. And in fact, part of the work of close reading, and this again goes back to your question, Paul, is for the critic to find those, or for the writer and the critic to think about what are the formal strategies that can maybe push back against these realities of Amazon and whatever else is trying to them. And I think that there are a lot of writers that, and this is actually a central argument in the book, that so if sentimental substitution, identification, right, that visceral kind of response to trauma is the thing that sells, a lot of the writers that I look at really resist that. And so they're pushing back against that kind of easy response or satisfying response. So you might have, lyrical opacity, you might have, corrosive humor, you might have farcical juxtaposition. And to me, it seems, and especially in the chapter on satire, I mean, that's kind of an open question for me. I'm not saying it's been resolved, but I think, because all of these books are incredibly successful, right? So it's not, none of this is kind of escaping that question. But it seems useful to me to think about how different kinds of modes, whether it's satire, whether it's, the kind of psychological realism, or whether it's speculation, how these genres or modes or both relate to these market forces. To me, it's a useful question and then worth probing.
I like this invitation to think of genres as inhabiting a kind of relative autonomous position vis-a-vis market forces, right? So on the one hand, we don't want to arrogate to the literary market the determination of meaning of literary works, which is to say that, okay, well, this is how they're managing our discourse about race and racism. But on the other hand, we also don't want to think that literary texts, are these sites for kind of unadulterated expressions of, cultural authenticity or something like that. It has to be something in between. And this goes back to the concept of genre for me, because, genre interpolates. It both interpolates the writer and the reader, interpolates into a set of conventions, but also in order for genre to work, it also has to kind of experiment with them, to defy or like subvert or transgress these conventions, right? So I think that's right to think about genre formations like the Neoslave narrative as kind of this relatively autonomous formation vis-a-vis the U.S. or literary market. So another plug for your book, like you, and it's going to segue into a question. So those who have, are fans of Toni Morrison, those who've read Colson Whitehead, those who've, are interested in reading Paul Beatty's Sellout, etc. All these books, get re-illuminated in Runaway Genres. So really compelling readings of them. And so the question is literary fiction, and with genre criticism, oftentimes scholars focus on genre fiction, like so kind of popular fiction, etc. But these are extremely prestigious works and authors, which is to say that they participate in a kind of international prestige economy, to quote Jim English. And so part of what is so useful about your book is it just shows how central race is to the establishment that we call literary fiction, because literary fiction wants to see itself as like kind of its own genre, or it doesn't, genre categories don't apply to it. And so I wondered if you could just maybe extend the book's arguments about the afterlives of slavery to think about how we approach the publishing ecology that has really channeled resources into this one genre that we call literary fiction, right? What do we do with the suspicion that, okay, well, a lot of this sophisticated thinking about the afterlives of slavery, about the workings of global kind of and Black racism, that they find expression aesthetically in these works that then get picked up by the Pulitzer or the National Book Award or the National Book Circle critics, etc.
I mean, so I guess maybe it's sort of like an oblique.
So, sorry, is it a popularization, like, and therefore a welcome one of the work that's being done in scholarship on race? So, say someone like Sadiya Hartman, and then Toni Morrison, and then out into the general public, or is there a different dynamic that you're interested in tracing?
No, that's helpful. I think I would say that in terms of, and I think the answer is probably different in different national contexts. So speak to the US for a moment, and I think I would say that the question of popularity when we think about literature of slavery is a difficult one, because as we know, and so Toni Morrison called the historical slave narrative a 19th century publication boom, and she's right, because they're immensely popular texts, right? And so when we go back and look at the figures of sales of Douglas's narrative, it's astonishing. And so I think that in some ways, and Morrison herself is a wonderful example, I think, of a writer who is, obviously sort of sits at the top of whatever ladder of international literary prestige one could construct, and at the same time is massively popular, right? Like that's just who she's been throughout. So again, sometimes I think these polarities are being constructed with maybe too much rigidity. And another way of saying that would be, and this is a little bit of a sort of tangent, but so when I was looking for literature that took up, analogies to slavery, for contemporary human rights violation, obviously a huge body of work is crime fiction, right? That's like so much of, and I'm by no means an expert in crime fiction, but anyone who's read these kind of, any crime fiction knows that there's all kinds of kidnappings going on from the global south, and there's plenty of stuff that refers to the slave narrative exactly in the way that I'm talking about. We could also think of, some of the kind of blockbuster films like the Taken series, right, that are kind of riffing on precisely the kinds of dynamics that I'm describing in this book. So I think that you could easily think about the questions that are here that I think about with these, authors of literary fiction. I think there's actually a great deal of interplay across different kinds of writing, right? And so we may have our separate categories for literary fiction and popular fiction, but again, somebody like Colson Whitehead, who, obviously, and again, Underground Railroad won all the awards, and he's obviously Intuitionist is a kind of very abstract and cerebral novel, but he also uses the genre of zombie fiction in, the zombie apocalypse in Zone 1, right? So I think the writers themselves, again, Chris Abani, whose work I write about quite a bit, he's talked about in the Nigerian context, sort of growing up and reading, all kinds of pamphlets, market literature, comic books, and noir. Like all of this has shaped his writing, right? You can see that in the work that they do. So I think that there's quite a lot of kind of fertile interplay, and that's one of the things that makes writing about contemporary fiction fun too, right? That there's a lot of stuff going on, and there's a lot of cross-fertilization, cross-pollination going on. So pulling them apart actually takes a little bit of work. I should also say, and I think this is where your question was also going, that to me, if I had to create some kind of linear narrative, I would, for the last kind of few decades of interest in the subject, obviously we would in some ways have to start with Alex Haley's Roots. And that is, again, an example of something that shaped the national conversation in a really profound way. But to me, it seems like, the work someone like Morrison has been doing for a very long time, and sort of was always influential within the academy, but we're living in a moment where that stuff is, and some of this is about, increased access, right, through things that we're doing right now, right? StreamYard and Zoom and all of that stuff. But so I think some of the sort of work that these writers have been doing, it's more easily accessible. And one of the things that's really fascinating to me, again, this goes back to some of the things that you talked about at the beginning about, so for example, you talked about the recent work on racial capitalism. And, so I have either sort of secondhand copies or, like of books like, only secondhand copies, right? The Capitalism and Slavery, Eric Williams's, or Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And so it's been really, so when I was in graduate school, which was a long time ago, you could either get a library copy or you could look for a used copy. You couldn't go to a bookstore and buy it. And so now a lot of that stuff is being republished. So in some ways, the recent interest in concepts of racial capitalism, or the renewed interest in Cedric Robinson's work on Black Marxism, it's been there before for several cycles, right? So we've kind of been here before several times, and so I'm sort of waiting to see when and where it settles, right? Like, is it going to be, because there's also, and again, this speaks to the question you had asked about I don't know, not quite in this language, but popularity or the kind of transmission of some of this stuff outside the academy's circulation, its popularity. So it's interesting. It's been really interesting to see how within certain circles we've gone from erasure of like complete erasure of the history of slavery to some kind of commodified trauma and healing and therapy model in a
Yeah.
short years, right? Like in a few.
Yeah.
So I actually did a trip to um, a plantation tour in 2014, spring 2014. So this was this was now that's a really long time ago. And I specifically chose plantations in Alabama and South Carolina um, that had some kind of that had already started some kind of effort to acknowledge slavery, right? So I didn't go to the ones that are just for weddings and have petting zoos and so on. And I have to say, it was one of the most kind of disturbing and appalling trips I've ever taken in my life, because the urge to erasure was
Wow.
so profound. And I have not had the chance to go back, but I know that we all know that there's all these projects underway, especially since Black Spring of 2020, and so
Yeah.
of national global conversation about Confederate monuments, about
Yes.
and across the world, all the stuff that's happening. So I think we're in a moment where we're going to see over the next few years, right, where and when this discourse settles.
Yeah.
And what we get to that we couldn't get to, let's say 15 years ago or 20 years ago or 30 years ago.
Yeah. 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 I think your book came out in 2018, and reading it, I did wonder like um, how, I mean, the argument obviously is still like valid and timely and resonant, but if it were written in the summer of 2020, with Black Lives Matter organizing that was happening. So I believe there's a question from Philip himself. So please, Philip, by all means, chime in.
I don't know if you all can hear me. Philip is at a family event, but as a characteristic comrade, I think he's probably ducked into a corner and is engaged watching. So it's a bit of a long comment with the invitation for response out there. So Philip writes, thinking with Paul's intro about the shift from form with Lukács to focus on genre. So first thought, this is very Philip. First thought, form presents itself as a problem in composition. For example, 19th century bourgeois drama can never find a satisfactory way to bring structural forces that social thought has revealed shape our lives onto the stage. The firm won't allow it. Genre, in contrast, would be a problem for the reader. Except that can't be right, because Annie McClanahan in Dead Pledges, Annie McClanahan is a part of it many, many years, obviously, yeah. Annie McClanahan in Dead Pledges has elegantly shown that the realist novel genre, structured around individual moral choice, hasn't been able to represent the 2008 financial crisis. So a writer who chooses that genre is screwed in advance. But if you pick the low-budget horror movie genre, where finance, by analogy, is the monster, you're home free. Just like Octavia Butler, by picking science fiction, can discover the sacrifice and sacrificial zones that are the essence of neoliberalism before neoliberalism comes to exist. So that's the comment inviting response. Anyway, thank you all.
No, well, my thanks to Philip and to Sean for bringing that in. That's great. I mean, I would say that for me, again, I don't know, I guess I would push back at the idea that certain genres bring with them a particular kind of fixed ideological content, right? So of course they do, and that's partly what we're tracking. Again, this is also Jameson, but I don't think that I mean, I think the one of the sort of primary reasons to read for genre is to read for the collective, as opposed to singular. Like, at least that's how I think about it. So to me, it does not actually follow that a realist novel cannot represent the 2008 financial collapse. Now, it may be true, as Annie has shown, that it tends not to. But I am completely, I have the glimmers of utopia are always present for me. So I think it can. I think the form itself can be adapted, you can have places within it. Again, this is where Jameson's work again is super helpful, because in part, and this is in part why I work on the novel in particular as a genre, because if we think about the novel, as he says, is a kind of genre that takes in all these other genres, then all those possibilities, right, the possibilities that exist in low budget horror can also do the work within a very conventional genre. And again, so just to kind of broaden out from that a little bit as well, so maybe not just in the sort of simply contemporary moment, I think that for me, part of the question of why certain genres come into being at certain times, right? Like why and again, collectively, right? Like, why do we start seeing certain things happening at certain moments? What historical convergence allows for it really stages the question of, and this is something, of course, Du Bois dealt with at many phases of his long life, that there's something about when political options seem blocked, right, or when we're living in a dumpster fire as we are right now, there's certain possibilities that different kinds of aesthetic projects can tap into. And so for me, part of the work that I'm trying to do is to be able to read those things, right? Like that's kind of what I'm going for. So I would, even though I like, I have a kind of taxonomic brain and I like to work with different kinds of categories, but I would resist that idea that certain genres are able to represent either historical transitions or uh, um, lived reality, or a particular kind of, I think Paul had said this before, the totality, that certain genres have a privileged relationship to that kind of knowledge across time and space, right? I don't think that's true. I think I think these things transform over time, and then the fun is kind of watching and seeing what happens when they transform.
Yeah. I really love that formulation, Yogita, that reading for genre is to read for the collective. I think it's certainly utopian. It certainly expresses a kind of socialist commitment. It also reminds me of really amazing early work of Raymond Williams that isn't read, but it's his 1954 preface to film, and this is where he first formulates his concept of structure of feeling. And there he defines genre as convention, right? Which makes sense intuitively. Like, genres are about kind of readerly expectations and the conventions that that writers and readers inherit. But he also means that convention as, like, in the other sense of a gathering, right? A conference. And so genre has become this site of debate, of contestation, of what values we value, what are the words and terms that we're using to make sense of reality. And I think it's that collectivist, dynamic, open-ended idea of genre that really is what your book Runaway Genres track in really thinking about the global afterlives of slavery. And yeah, so I just really love that formula. I'm going to quote you on that. Reading for genre is to read for the collective. And okay, so I guess one other question I had, and this could be my final question, and I'm thinking of the audience. So the question of periodization And in your comments earlier, you had indicated that one of the things that you were trying to think through in this book is, when did the slave narrative become a global form, right? And I'm trying to find in my notes, you came close to a periodizing claim in the introduction when you said that sorry, my notes are kind of all over the place. That the Neoslave narrative became a major genre in African American literature after the 1960s. And so really this moment of civil rights, really contending with the legacies of slavery. And then you also brought in, and this is after the 1960s, but postmodernism, right, with its aesthetic kind of penchant to blurring the line between history and fiction. But what's interesting is that in this moment in the introduction, we're kind of laying out a timeline, as it were. So it becomes a major genre, the neo-slave narrative, in the 1960s. But then in the 1980s, you note that it becomes more diffused politically, right? That the slave narrative expands to include a larger variety of returns to slavery, etc. So there's something about the 1980s that signals something new about the genre of the slave narrative. And to me, it's just like interesting because the timeline maps so not neatly, but it maps onto how people are thinking about the histories of neoliberalism, say.
So actually, it's a little bit later, right? So that we have some, like there's Margaret Walker's Jubilee. That's one of the early neo-slave narratives. And then, of course, there's Roots, as we've already talked about. It's really sort of late 70s, 80s, 90s. That's when we see, the return to the form of the slave narrative in the US, right, by American writers. And it really sort of happens then. In terms of sort of when it becomes global, I would actually say it's even later. It's the 20th century. We really are talking about the last 2 decades here, and so that's kind of the sort of slight. It's a little bit later than that, than what you were saying. And so I think that there is, and other people have made this argument. There's a tendency to assume that we can. And again, Stephen Best has written about this. Obviously, Adolph Reed has written about this. Lots of people have written about this already. That there's a tendency to assume that when we see the proliferation of, something like this, the return to slavery, or the slave narrative in particular, that we're going to be able to say that will be congruent with, let's say, a turn to neoliberalism, right? So again, and this is kind of one of those narratives that we have in the field that I don't think is warranted. There's to it, but it's not fully. We can find so many counterexamples, right? And I think it's more complicated. So, for example, one could say, and I think one could say it with some degree of confidence, that if we look at the literature of civil rights and Black Power, genres like poetry, spoken word, theater assume center stage, because again, that's the time when people are out in the streets. It's this effort to create these collectivist projects, so it makes perfect sense. And then we can kind of see the turn inward to the rise of the African American woman writer in the 1980s, let's say, right? And so, as I said, I think that's a defensible claim to make, but it's not the whole story. And so I would resist kind of suggesting that and some people have made this claim. Again, it's very persuasive in a lot of ways. And I think same political investments. I want to make that clear. So this is not kind of a critique of what they're saying. It just seems to me, and again, this is an argument about relative autonomy in some ways, but in my research, what I find is that the turn to slavery can mean so many different things. And it can mean things sort of across the political spectrum, Writers can do things with it that are unexpected. They can do things with it that simply repeat things that have happened in the past. So I would resist limiting it to a particular reflection of economic shift. I think the relationship is there, but I would not say that it's as simple as, neoliberalism explaining a particular
Sure.
diverse and kind of very contested body of work.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we might be close to the hour and a half mark, but I just want to you spoke about ventriloquism. I'm gonna ventriloquize part of the book's arguments here because I just really like this moment. So this is Yogita, and we'll end here, I suppose. The task isn't to define what is and isn't slavery, who is and isn't a slave. Rather, rather, I'm interested in exploring how the world slavery may be likened to extreme forms of oppression today. To think slavery not as an exception, but as part of a continuum of unfree labor and hyper-exploitative practices must necessarily involve an analysis of race, because how we understand race in the United States is centrally framed by the African-American experience of slavery. And then you go on and insist on an analogical approach, but also this way of writing and thinking about genre that is also a way of reading and writing for the collective. So thank you so much, Yogita. This has just been such a pleasure and such a treat to engage and discuss your very important book, and we have so much to learn from it. And
Thank you so much, Paul, for your generosity in engaging with it. This has really been incredibly wonderful for me, and then thanks to Sean and to Philip as well.
Yeah.
Just a reminder to all the viewers out there watching this that book that we've been talking about at this event is Runaway Genres, The Global Afterlives of Slavery. I have to thank you all so much. It's one of the pleasures and joys of being able to participate and sit in with these events that I just end up learning so much. I frankly, just full disclosure, I'm more of like a science guy. So I get to really sort of embrace new sort of whole orientations to the world that are honestly probably way more effective and significant than the really boring stuff that I look at. And I get also the pleasure of being able to sort of make these lists of things to explore throughout the year, thanks to wonderful conversations like this. So thank you all very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Have a good night, everyone. Oh, yeah. Was there any final?
Good. Let me just remind everybody.
Oh, right. Future events. Yes. More Red May events.
We've got a few events coming up this week. I just wanted to remind you all of. Tomorrow on Sunday, May 15th at 11 a.m., we have Walter Benjamin's Message in a Bottle. And on Wednesday, May 18th at 11 a.m., we have Confronting the Obstacles to Climate Security. If you're in town with us this week, we continue our look into the works of Milos Janskos at the Beacon Cinema. And Tuesday, that's May 17th at 7:30 p.m., we'll be watching his 1969 brutal classic, Winter Wind. And furthermore, our friend and sort of a Red May veteran, Andy Gitlitz, will be at Third Place Books on May 20th to discuss the now, Assadist historical classic, I Want to Believe. If you have enjoyed the conversation that we've been watching this afternoon, or any of the events that you've seen thus far, feel free to donate to Red May. We have a GoFundMe link for one-time donations, as well as a more sort of concerted commitment with Patreon subscriptions that you can find at patreon.com/RedMaySeattle. Anyhow, thanks again for joining us. Hope to see you all soon. And Paul and Yogita, thank you so much. And we hope to have you up here in person sometime in the coming years.
Okay. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Have a good night.